just I guess open up the space.
I have a question for you. So, of course, Lorca's famous for the letters that he wrote to other poets. So, I guess I'm just curious to know what was your thinking in terms of consciously taking on that kind of letter writing too?
So, one of the most influential books for me as a graduate student in poetry was reading a poet in New York, which is when Lorca Goes to New York. And then the idea of like this, this gay socialist who has to flee Spain during Franco's regime and go to New York in exile, and then, and he has and I think he actually went to other places in the U.S., not just New York. He's more famous for going to New York. But eventually, because of all the things going on back home with Franco and his family, he ultimately decides to return. But he also understands that if he goes home, it's almost certainly a death sentence for him. But he does it anyway, and he returns to Spain. And within a few days, he's disappeared, and he is taken out. And as people, I guess part of the legend is that he is executed by a firing squad, and no one knows actually where his body is. And still to this day, there's speculation, but they've never found it. And so I think, for me, having an interest in that, because of people that I know who have a lot of family members who were killed, who don't also know where their bodies are. You can't really mourn if you also don't have, a physical thing to mourn, a physical space. It kind of really kind of stuck with me, thinking about those histories of people who have lost people that they love to violence, to the state, to all of these things, but also not having any kind of conclusion. And then also the other part of that was I read Jack Spicer's letters called After Lorca, which if you haven't read that is incredible. And they are Jack Spicer's interpretations of letters to Lorca. And so that kind of is, I guess, where it started, thinking of this idea of writing to our quote-unquote ancestors, poets that I really identify with, being queer, also feeling this kind of finality to how things end for people. I think about Neruda, his death is questionable. People say he died of cancer, but he died within days after Pinochet came to power in Chile. There's Victor Jara, there's so many artists and poets, and just, I guess for me, thinking about that, because when I started writing this book, it was really after the election. And so just thinking about how we're going to have to, as poets, as writers, as creative people, this is our platforms. These are our platforms, and this is how we can't be silent. And Lorca was a heavy influence on me for that.
Mm-hmm. And you have that history in your own family too. You mentioned of your great grandfather.
Yeah, it's digging, just finding these things out. Things that I didn't know, that on my father's side, and he wasn't the only one. My father's named for his great grandfather, who's Salvador. Like I said in the poem, he was murdered in Acuña, which is the border town across from, I think it's Del Rio, which is where my dad's from. He's from the border. But also his father, whose name I think was also Salvador, he was also killed. He was a police officer, and he was shot in the back and murdered. So just having that kind of history and thinking about the ways that it kind of turns up, you know, in like, not just trauma, but in like the ways that we kind of interact with space and the world. And I've always been kind of paranoid, like even as a child. And my mom always thought I was crazy, but you know, the more I learned about my family and the more I kind of learned how these things work, it makes more sense to me that I am naturally distrusting of people. You know, thinking about my family's history, and kind of, I don't know, yeah, just thinking about that. You know. Anybody?
I'll just say one more thing about it. I collaborate with a woman who's a visual artist who's from Hiroshima, and so she's a third-generation survivor of the atomic bombs, and she says that she totally never discussed in her family what those experiences were, but she says she's lived her whole life like being afraid, feeling fear. It's just a different ontological orientation, a different way of being to live with that generational.
Well, it's like part of the idea of the book of Me the Blood came also from Marx is it's not Marx, but it's Derrida's Spectres of Marx, and where he talks about this thing that is, he talks about ghosts, and I think he like specifically references, he's talking about Marxism in Europe, but he's also talking about Hamlet and the ghost of his father, and just this idea of like things that are present but they're also absent, but they kind of like exist in this space. And I thought it was, you know, it's so funny because we haven't met and this is our first time meeting, but there's so much like echoes in our work. And when I was a child, I was like really obsessed with reading about the history of the atomic bomb. And I was like a fourth grader, you know, and it's like kind of a joke, but it's like not a joke about, you know, queers with astrology. Like people always talk about how obsessed we are with astrology, and like I'm part of that. And I recently found out that I think it's my best friend is like super into it, and she was telling me that my 11th house is in Capricorn, which is the house of fun. But since it's in Capricorn, I don't know what that is. And so for me, fun is like being obsessed about things like that. And so when I was a fourth grader, I remember, you know, like they gave us you know, we could research anything, and I chose to research the atomic bomb. And I read a lot about Los Alamos, and I read a lot about J. Robert Oppenheimer. But then I also became really curious with like, well, what happened to the people that we used the bomb on? And I started reading a lot about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and like the legacy of the atom bomb. And so it was like really interesting that you actually like grew up there. I lived in El Paso also, so I had also been out there too. You know, just like these different, you know, connections. And I think that that's definitely Martha, just like, you know, I definitely feel like she's been watching over me.
I have a question for both of you guys. I noticed that, of course, we just talked about it, how the environment plays a lot into how you guys express yourselves through your writings. And I guess you both have had times living in like really condensed spaces and then really open spaces throughout your lives. How has that affected certain works? Do you notice that like your writing styles while you're living in either like condensed space or open space have changed, or if there's any way like a pattern or something that happens as a result of where you are physically?
That's a really interesting knowledge.
It is a super interesting question. I don't think that I have a good answer to it, except to say that I've somehow always ended up, even when I'm in a city, near a place where I can have an open space. And to me, like a walking meditation is a really central practice to how I am as a person, a writer and thinker. That's really important to me, to be able to walk. So, and those spaces can take all sorts of forms. A lot of times it seemed to be cemeteries. When I first moved I live in Portland, Oregon, and when I first moved there from New York, I just finished Greenwood, I was finishing it, and I happened to rent a place next to the oldest cemetery in the city. I think just chance. So I think I seek out those places to have solitude.
I love that question. It's a great question. Being from Texas, I'm really always aware of space. I grew up in rural Texas, in like North rural Texas, which is like close to Amarillo. I don't know if anyone's ever been out there, but that's like the bottom part of the Great Plains. It was really flat and it's very open. I mean, you could see miles in any given direction. Anytime we drive home at night, I could be like 15, 20 miles away from my town, but I can still see all the lights right from the town because that's how flat and clear it is. And so growing up in a place like that, it's also very quiet. It's a very quiet place. There are very quiet people. The way that people talk is very quiet. It's very you just don't get a lot of information from people, even though they're nice. They're very friendly. And so relationally, I feel like it influenced me a lot as a person. And then I came to Austin when I was 18, and Austin wasn't like it is now. It was still like a small place. But I've never lived in a large city. But I've been many times to, like New York and whatever. And I do think that there is like a big difference for me. I like being able to hear everything. I like being able to see everything, but it also actually gives me a lot of anxiety and fear. Like because I actually grew up near a cemetery. There was a cemetery a mile from my house. And so actually when I go home, I have a lot of there's a lot of anxiety for me being in those spaces. But then being in a city like New York or Los Angeles, or I've been to Bogota, like just loud, large, dense urban spaces, I don't feel the same way. And I think it's maybe because of the noise. There's just like a lot of stimulation and distraction. But I think that I don't know if it does this to you, but it definitely feeds into the work. And the way that I guess the geography is such an integral part of my poetry. Being related to the land, being aware of these spaces in Texas is definitely a character in my work.
I like the line where you said methane raised. Mm-hmm. Is there a lot of gas?
There's a lot of cows.
There's a lot of cows.
Yeah, it's cattle country. It's everywhere. There's dairy farms and feed yards. And actually, there's a town about 20 miles north of where I live, where I grew up. And when you get there, when you're driving to it, so there's the town, and then there's a cutoff, a shortcut that you can take to go to Amarillo. And so if you take the shortcut to go to Amarillo, which gets you to the highway, which is I-40, it's called we call it Big Daddy's Cutoff. And right before you get there, there's this. It's flat, but there's one part where it's a dip, and on both sides of that dip are just these huge feed yards, and you can smell the feed yards about a mile, 2 miles before you even get there. And so you have to turn the air off and close the windows, and even still you can still smell it as it's coming in, and it's just part of growing up there. You just everybody there is agriculture is a big industry. The cattle industry is a really big industry. I don't know if anyone remembers or knew about this, but Oprah Winfrey had this episode where she talks about mad cow disease, and I think this was late 90s. And the cattle barons from Amarillo sued her. Wow. And she had to come from Chicago, and she had to go to Amarillo, and there was a whole trial about it. And because their argument was that because of her episode and her influence, it made their sales drop. And so they sued her. But she ended up winning, because that's ridiculous.
Censorship.
Yeah.
I actually had, it's funny because you asked about space. I was thinking about time when I was listening to both of you read. I was kind of experiencing this sort of very fluid sense of time versus, I'm thinking too about how you talked about closed hope and then this intergenerational transmission of trauma at the same time as an anticipation of trauma, of environmental destruction, all that, so that you're kind of caught in this moment that is also not without trauma in the present. But I was just thinking about formally your work and how you maybe think about time, or what, I don't really know what I'm asking, but it struck me.
It's funny. I remember having this conversation with, do you know Wa? We were talking one day and we were talking about time, and I told her, like half jokingly, but also not, that time is a colonial construct. That I don't understand time. I don't believe in time. I never know. I always know what time it is, but I also never know what time it is. Because for me, time is not linear. It's ongoing. It's a project. Time is always a project. So that's kind of, I guess, like how I think about it. And it's, I think for me as a writer, it's hard sometimes because I think that way. I always need to have really good editors because my switching of tenses, just like I go in and out of the present, the past, and the future. And they're just like, what are you doing? All the time. And so I really have to benefit from having good editors who are like, you're using the wrong tense. But that's because I'm like, yeah, but it's because I don't have any sense of like what moment this is.
To oppose the colonial construct,
Yeah.
which it is really. Clock time is an imperial and colonial.
It's very Western.
And that's such a good, I love that question too. When I was writing Greenwood, my instinct was to like dig down, like not literally in the cemetery, but get to the bottom of something that could help explain how this thing happened that was September 11th and the ensuing wars. And I was really, as I was uncovering, attitudes towards environment and landscape in not only U.S. culture, but in Western culture, and I was feeling that how present all of that still is with everything unfolding everywhere in our culture, but in that particular piece of ground and in the battles over the World Trade Center, which is one of the most expensive pieces of real estate on earth, and the ways that attitudes toward private property all feed into that are the construct of our nation. So I really also feel like time is, the past is so present in everything, in every instant. I've been reading this amazing physicist called Karen Barad, who wrote this book called Meeting the Universe Halfway. She's a quantum physicist, and so she talks about the quantum basis for the, that the implications of quantum physics that really have never been, quantum physics has become like sort of pop science, but if you take the basis of it really seriously, like it sort of undoes all of colonial culture and Western metaphysics, like individualism doesn't work, we're not individuals, like there's no past, that's all the same time, and we're all the same thing, so.
Yeah, it's like constantly happening in many different places. Like Stephen Hawking also like that.
Yeah, so I love that. Thanks for coming, everybody. Oh, we got one more.
I'm curious, like, both of you seem to do, have done a lot of research kind of in your work. It seems apparent there's like research that you did where you kind of like nerded out and, dug deep and like found some really interesting things from, family history or just history in general. And I'm curious if there was ever, if that led you to some interesting, like, meeting people to ask questions from them and like interviewing real people in real life to dig deeper to find out more, just to like continue with your writing that you were like working on?
The book that's coming out this month, originally I wanted to write a book about the four horsemen of the Bible. And so that was my original idea, was and so I was like really interested in the book of Revelation and kind of just like going back into that. And then, you know, and when I told Anar, my editor, she was like, that's a pretty big, you know, pretty big thing to tackle. And so I was like doing a lot of my own research and trying to like parse out how I was going to do that. And then one day I was talking to my boss, who likes to sit, I work in coffee, and so he likes to sit at the bar. He studied philosophy, and he's very also interested in theology. So he was sitting with me one day, and we just started chatting, and we started talking about the book of Revelation, and we started talking, and then we kind of just went on this completely different tangent about conspiracy theories, and you know, and this idea of the end of the world and the apocalypse. And I thought you put it really well. Like, I also think the world has already ended. People just don't realize it yet, and it's ended for a lot of other people that are outside of the United States, but we're just so obsessed with our own exceptionalism that we don't think about that. But anyway, he and I were talking, and that's kind of like how I wrote the book that I wrote instead, was because of that conversation that I had with him, in which, even though we started talking about the end of the world, eventually like it came back into this other conversation about love and about, you know, like community and like having these things when everything looks so dark and so, you know, and so dry. And also like during that time it was around the fires that were, you know, consuming Los Angeles, and I was following this person on Instagram, and she lived in LA, and she was posting these photos of herself in a gas mask, but in like very ludicrous situations. So she was like, one of them that really stuck out to me was she was laying in her bed in lingerie with the gas mask on, and like that image just kind of like, you know, just kind of like stuck with me, like, one, because it's like funny, but it's also like not funny, you know, and like that juxtaposition of like, this is like really grim, where like our world's in this position, and yet it's also very normal for us too.
Yeah, I like that question. I have a book that's coming out next year called Plastic, an autobiography that's about plastic, and it's autobiography. And there is a lot of interviews and work with actual really good people. But the one thing about Greenwood is I read that piece of it about Sergeant Benke. I always read that piece because when I was writing the book, some of it had been published online, and I got this email. Actually, it was with my mom. I was at home. I got this email from someone named Benke, and it had no subject and no content except a link to a YouTube tribute to Sergeant Benke, and I was like, because that book is quite anti-war, and I don't know how to take this message. But I just wrote back and said, thank you for the beautiful tribute. And it turned out to be Sergeant Benke's brother, Mike. And we struck up a correspondence and have continued it for now, you know, many 10 years plus. And when the book came out the first time 10 years ago, I read from it in the chapel at Greenwood Cemetery. And Sergeant Benke's entire family, including his widow, came to the reading, because it is literally like half a page in this huge book. It's one reference, but it was so important to his family to have him be remembered. And it was so humbling, what a humbling experience for me to realize that people will take a text and use it for what they need it to do for them. So that was the, you know, like as a poet, we're not really used to having audiences. So the fact that, you know, someone had purposed that for their lives was really interesting. It's become harder to be friends with Mike since he voted for president, but we're working on it. Thanks, everybody. It was so lovely of you to come and stay and chat. Thanks for being here.
Allison Books.